Picture this: a king raises his sword, his army poised for victory, when suddenly the skies darken. A downpour erupts, turning the battlefield into a sea of mud. Horses stumble, arrows fall short, and in an instant, the tide of battle shifts. This wasn't just bad luck, it was nature rewriting history. Across medieval Europe, weather didn't just accompany war, it dictated it. From blinding blizzards to scorching droughts, the elements became silent commanders, shaping the rise and fall of empires with a force no army could ignore. Think of the most legendary battles you've heard of: Agincourt, Hastings, the Mongol invasions. Behind every clash of steel, there's an untold story of wind, rain, and ice pulling the strings. What if I told you that some of history's most celebrated victories weren't just won by bravery or tactics, but by a sudden gust of wind or an unexpected thaw? Take the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where English longbowmen, outnumbered and exhausted, watched as torrential rains transformed the French charge into a sluggish nightmare. The mud became their ally, dragging down armored knights like quicksand. Or consider the Mongols, whose conquests were nearly undone not by enemy swords, but by the general winter of Russia. Freezing temperatures so brutal they turned an unstoppable horde into a retreating shadow. Weather wasn't just a backdrop, it was a game changer, a wild card that could humble the mightiest armies. This is the hidden drama of medieval warfare, where kingdoms rose or fell on the whims of the sky. Over the next minutes, we'll journey through storms that saved nations, frosts that shattered empires, and winds that redirected the course of history. You'll see how commanders prayed for rain as fervently as they planned their attacks, and how a single weather event could rewrite the destiny of millions. So settle in, because this isn't just a tale of battles, it's a revelation of how nature, armed with nothing but clouds and cold, outmaneuvered the greatest military minds of the Middle Ages. The forecast, a storm of stories you won't forget. To understand how weather could make or break medieval battles, we first need to step back and examine the skies above Europe during this turbulent era. The Middle Ages straddled two dramatic climate shifts: the fading warmth of what scholars call the medieval warm period, and the creeping chill of the approaching Little Ice Age. Imagine living in a world where summers could swing from drought parched to flood-soaked without warning, where winters arrived early with a vengeance, freezing rivers solid that once served as highways for armies. These weren't just seasonal quirks, they were game-changing forces that commanders had to factor into every campaign. Take the medieval warm period, roughly from the 9th to the 13th century. This was a time when vineyards flourished in England, and Norse settlers farmed Greenland's now frozen coasts. But as temperatures began to dip in the 14th century, the pendulum swung violently the other way. The Little Ice Age brought winters so severe that the Thames River froze solid enough to host frost fairs, and alpine glaciers swallowed entire villages. For armies on the move, this meant supply routes buried under snow, harvests failing, and foraging parties returning empty-handed. A sudden cold snap could strand an army without food, while an unseasonal thaw might flood a planned battleground, trapping heavy cavalry in mud. The real challenge wasn't just the cold or rain, it was the unpredictability. Unlike modern meteorology, medieval commanders had no satellite forecasts or weather vanes. They relied on folk signs, the flight patterns of birds, or the ache of old wounds to guess the next day's conditions. A wrong bet could be catastrophic. Picture a general timing his attack based on last year's dry autumn, only to find his archers' bowstrings soaked through by an early storm. or consider sieges planned for winter, when frozen moats made walls easier to scale until a warm spell turned those same moats into impassable swamps. Weather didn't just influence battles, it dictated when and where they could even happen. This climatic roller coaster forced armies to adapt in surprising ways. The English, for instance, learned to stockpile spare bowstrings in waxed cases to keep them dry. The Mongols, masters of mobility, timed their campaigns around the freeze-thaw cycles of the Eurasian steppes, using frozen rivers as highways for their lightning-fast cavalry. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, naval powers like Venice and Genoa adjusted their sailing seasons to avoid the deadly winter storms that could swallow entire fleets. Every decision, from the weight of a knight's armor to the design of siege engines, had to account for nature's whims. So when we talk about medieval battles, we're not just talking about swords and shields, we're talking about a world where the very air could turn the tide. The next time you hear about a legendary victory, ask yourself, was it truly the general's genius, or did the weather hand them an invisible advantage? Because in an era where nature wrote the rules, even the mightiest armies were just players in a much larger storm. The fields near Agincourt were silent on the evening of October 24, 1415, but not for long. As darkness fell, so did the rain, a relentless downpour that didn't stop until dawn. By morning, the freshly plowed earth had become a nightmare of clinging mud, a detail most history books gloss over. Yet this wasn't just bad weather. It was the silent architect of one of England's most improbable victories. Picture the scene: French knights, confident in their superior numbers and gleaming plate armor, found themselves sinking knee-deep with every step. Their greatest strength, sheer weight and momentum, became their downfall as the terrain conspired against them. Henry V's army, exhausted from weeks of marching and ravaged by dysentery, should have been easy prey. But their secret weapon wasn't just the longbow, it was adaptability. While French cavalry struggled to even reach the English lines, bogged down like ships in tar, Henry's archers moved freely. Their lightweight gear and cloth footwear gave them traction where knights in steel sabatons floundered. And when the French finally closed the distance, their own armor worked against them. Exhausted from wading through mud, many suffocated face down in the mire under the weight of their own equipment. The rain's impact went deeper than just terrain. Humidity loosened the strings of crossbows, the French's preferred ranged weapon, while English archers kept their bowstrings dry under hats and waxed wraps. Even the arrows found unexpected advantage, striking at shallow angles into the mud. They created a deadly obstacle course of splintered wood that further tripped up advancing troops. Nature hadn't just leveled the playing field, it had tilted it decisively toward the underdog. What makes Agincourt so fascinating isn't just the victory, it's how close it came to never happening. Had the weather held, the French heavy cavalry might have overrun the English in minutes. Instead, a single night of rain rewrote the rules of engagement, proving that in medieval warfare, the skies could be as decisive as any general's battle plan. This wasn't a triumph of arms alone. It was a reminder that even the mightiest armies marched at the mercy of the elements. Hungary's plains stretched wide and vulnerable in the spring of 1241, but by winter they had turned into an icy chessboard, and the Mongols were masters of the game. When Subutai and Batu Khan's forces swept into Europe, they didn't just bring arrows and siege engines, they brought an intimate knowledge of how to weaponize winter itself. While Hungarian knights shivered in their cumbersome armor, the Mongols rode light, their layered fur and leather clothing allowing flexibility in temperatures that froze European wine in its casks. The very cold that crippled traditional armies became the Mongols' highway. Their horses, bred for the steppes, traversed frozen rivers like open roads, while European heavy cavalry struggled to move at all. The secret wasn't just endurance, it was strategy. Mongol scouts had studied the Carpathian Basin's climate for years, timing their invasion for the deepest freeze. Frozen ground meant no mud to slow their ponies, and iced-over marshes became shortcuts rather than obstacles. Meanwhile, King Bela IV's forces, accustomed to summer campaigns, found their supply lines paralyzed. Wagons meant for grassy fields sank into snowdrifts, and local crops, buried under frost, left troops starving. Even the Mongols' famed retreats were weather play, luring European pursuers into blizzards where visibility dropped to zero, only to circle back and pick them off with arrows from the blinding white. But the real genius lay in adaptation. While European armies relied on static castles and fixed formations, the Mongols treated winter like a living ally. They lit false campfires to mislead scouts in snowstorms, used ice to reinforce their makeshift bridges, and even smeared grease on their bowstrings to prevent freezing. When the Tisa River froze solid, it wasn't just a barrier. It became a Mongol staging ground, allowing them to bypass fortified crossings entirely. By contrast, Hungarian knights, trained for close-quarters combat on stable ground, found their lances useless in winds that knocked arrows off course and their visibility limited to the breath steaming before their faces. The invasion's climax at the Battle of Mohi revealed winter's cruelest irony. As the Mongols feigned retreat across the frozen Sojo River, Hungarian forces gave chase only for the ice to crack under their weight, swallowing men and horses alike. The Mongols, who'd scouted the ice's thickness in advance, doubled back to pick off survivors with ruthless efficiency. In the end, Hungary didn't just lose a battle. It lost nearly half its population to massacre and famine, all because an army from the other side of the world understood snow better than those who lived in it. This wasn't just conquest, it was a masterclass in environmental warfare. The Mongols didn't defeat Europe with sheer numbers, they outthought it, using winter as both weapon and shield. Their legacy teaches a chilling lesson. In medieval warfare, the greatest generals weren't always human. Sometimes they were the winds howling across the plain, the ice thickening on the river, or the snow piling silently on an unsuspecting army's path. By the summer of 1588, Spain's mighty Armada was the terror of Europe. 130 ships, 30,000 men, and a mission to crush Protestant England under the heel of Catholic Spain. But Philip II's grand design didn't account for one unshakable truth: the English Channel's weather played no favorites. What followed wasn't just a naval defeat, it was a meteorological dismantling of an empire's pride. The so-called Protestant winds that harried the Armada weren't divine intervention, but they might as well have been. Gale-force storms scattered the Spanish formation, driving ships onto rocky coasts, while English vessels, nimbler and built for these waters, darted between squalls to pick off stragglers. The real twist of fate came after the fighting, as the battered Armada attempted to retreat by sailing north around Scotland. It ran into some of the worst storms in living memory. Imagine towering waves swallowing galleons whole, masts snapping like twigs, and seasoned sailors praying for mercy from the sea. Ships that had survived cannon fire now foundered in the tempest, their hulls dashed against the cliffs of Ireland. Of the original fleet, barely half made it home, and those that did returned with crews starving, diseased, and broken by the ordeal. The elements hadn't just weakened Spain's grip on the seas, they'd humiliated the world's foremost superpower without firing a shot. What makes the Armada's story so compelling is how it echoes medieval battles despite its early modern timing. Just like at Agincourt or Mohi, weather didn't just influence the outcome, it dictated it. Spanish commanders had planned for English cannons, but not for the Channel's fickle squalls. Their heavy, high-sided galleons, perfect for Mediterranean calm, became death traps in the North Atlantic's chop. Meanwhile, England's smaller ships, designed for speed and maneuverability, turned the wind itself into a weapon, using it to outflank and outgun their opponents. The lesson was clear: even as warfare evolved, nature remained the ultimate wildcard. This wasn't just a turning point in naval history. It was a reminder that no empire, no matter how vast, could outmaneuver the skies. The Armada's wreckage littering the shores of Scotland and Ireland became a grim monument to weather's power. And for England, the storms of 1588 didn't just bring victory. They marked the dawn of a maritime dominance that would last centuries, all because the wind blew the right way at the right time. The frozen expanse of Lake Peipus in 1242 looked deceptively solid until the screams began. Alexander Nevsky, the young prince of Novgorod, didn't just face the Teutonic Knights head-on, he let the ice do the fighting for him. As the Crusaders charged across the lake in their signature wedge formation, the groaning of stressed ice beneath their plate armor grew louder than their battle cries. Nevsky's lighter-clad forces, familiar with the lake's springtime treachery, deliberately lured the knights toward its weakest patches, where the ice was thinnest near flowing underwater currents. The moment the first crack spiderwebbed beneath a knight's warhorse, the battle's fate was sealed. This wasn't just a clash of steel, it was a physics lesson in medieval warfare. The Teutonic Knights, weighing down with chainmail, plate, and heavy weaponry, exerted nearly 5 times the pressure per square inch as Nevsky's foot soldiers. When the ice finally gave way, it didn't merely inconvenience the knights, it swallowed them whole. Those who didn't drown immediately faced a grislier fate, dragged under by their own armor, their last breaths bubbling up through the icy fracture lines. Meanwhile, Nevsky's men, wearing padded gambesons and felt boots, darted across the frozen surface to finish off survivors, their mobility turning the lake into a lethal chessboard. The brilliance of Nevsky's strategy lay in its preparation. Local fishermen had advised him on the ice's temperament, where underground springs weakened the surface, where snowdrifts masked thin patches. He even timed the battle for late April, when daylight warmth slightly softened the ice just enough to be treacherous for armored men, but still held for the unburdened. The Teutonic Knights, fresh from Baltic campaigns, assumed frozen lakes were uniformly solid, a fatal miscalculation in terrain intelligence. Their vaunted Iron Pig formation, nearly unstoppable on land, became a death trap when the ground itself turned against them. What makes Lake Peipus extraordinary isn't just the ice, it's how Nevsky weaponized every aspect of winter. The glare off the snow blinded crossbowmen aiming at his troops. The biting wind carried the cries of drowning knights to demoralize their comrades. Even the cold air played its part, stiffening the leather straps of the Teuton's armor until movement became exhausting labor. By contrast, Nevsky's forces wore layered wool and fur that retained heat without sacrificing mobility, proving once again that in medieval warfare, understanding weather wasn't just tactical, it was existential. The aftermath reshaped Eastern Europe. The Teutonic Order never fully recovered its aura of invincibility, while Nevsky's reputation as a defender of Ru's lands against Western invaders was cemented in legend. But beneath the heroics lies a humbler truth. The battle was won not by swords alone, but by a prince who listened to fishermen about ice thickness, who studied how armor changed weight distribution, and who recognized that sometimes the greatest ally wasn't an army, it was the merciless physics of a frozen lake in spring. The Holy Land's sun beat down like a hammer on steel as the First Crusades knights trudged toward Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. These were men bred for Europe's damp forests and rolling fields, not the blistering sands of the Levant. Their heavy chainmail, perfect for deflecting sword blows, became ovens in the desert heat, roasting wearers alive. Dehydration turned disciplined armies into desperate mobs. Chronicles tell of soldiers drinking their own horse's blood or collapsing mid-march, their tongues swollen past speech. Heatstroke didn't just weaken the Crusaders, it reshaped their entire campaign. Battles planned for dawn were postponed as men lay delirious in their tents, while water shortages forced armies to abandon strategic positions for the nearest oasis. But the desert's cruelty had a twisted rhythm. Just as Crusaders adapted to drought, the skies would unleash torrents without warning. Flash floods in arid wadis swept away entire supply trains, drowning pack animals and spoiling grain stores in minutes. The same knights who'd prayed for rain days earlier now watched helplessly as their tents floated away in muddy currents. These weren't mere inconveniences, they were existential threats. During the siege of Antioch, sudden downpours ruined stockpiled siege engines, while putrid standing water bred dysentery that killed more men than enemy arrows. Nature seemed to conspire against the invaders at every turn, punishing them for their unfamiliarity with the land's harsh heartbeat. What made the Crusades uniquely brutal wasn't just the fighting, it was the climate whiplash. European commanders, accustomed to predictable seasons, faced a land where temperatures could swing 40 degrees in a day. Sandstorms blinded scouts at noon, while frigid nights left men shivering in sweat-soaked gambesons. Even the Crusaders' armor became a liability. The Saracens' light linen tunics allowed evaporative cooling, while Frankish chainmail conducted heat like a cookpot. Local Bedouin guides became as vital as swordsmen, teaching parched armies to find hidden springs or predict the sirocco winds that could bury a camp in dunes overnight. The ultimate irony, many Crusader victories came not from overcoming these conditions, but by learning from them. At the Battle of Ascalon in 1099, Godfrey of Bouillon timed his attack for dawn, knowing the desert's nighttime chill left Fatimid troops sluggish until mid-morning. Decades later, Richard the Lionheart's forces marched at night to avoid heat exhaustion, using the stars as guides. Adaptation wasn't just tactical, it was biological. Over generations, Crusader states intermarried with locals, producing children better suited to the climate, while imported European crops failed until farmers adopted Arab irrigation techniques. This was the Crusades' untold story, a war fought not just against Saracen armies but against a landscape that resisted foreign dominion. The Holy Land didn't care about religious zeal, it demanded respect for its rhythms. Those who ignored its warnings found graves in the sand, those who listened carved kingdoms from the wilderness. In the end, weather didn't just influence the Crusades, it determined which outsiders could endure and which would be bleached to bone under an unrelenting sun. Vienna in 1529 should have fallen. Suleiman the Magnificent's Ottoman army was the most formidable fighting force on earth, over 120,000 strong, with siege engineers who'd toppled Constantinople's walls and a supply train stretching back to Istanbul. But as the Sultan's cannons rolled toward the city's gates that September, an unexpected foe intervened. The skies opened. Torrential autumn rains, rare for the season, turned the Danube's floodplains into quagmires. Ottoman gun crews watched helplessly as their prized bombards, some weighing 8 tons, sank axle-deep in mud. Each day's delay meant fewer rations for men and pack animals, while dysentery and typhus raced through waterlogged tents. What began as a triumphant march became a slog against nature itself. The rains didn't just hinder, they reshaped strategy. Suleiman's plan relied on speed, overwhelm Vienna's outdated walls before winter. But flooded rivers forced detours, delaying his arrival by 3 critical weeks. By the time sappers could dig siege trenches, the ground was so saturated that tunnels collapsed. Even the Janissaries, Europe's most feared infantry, struggled to reload their arquebuses with damp powder. Meanwhile, inside the city, defenders used the weather to their advantage. They lit bonfires on the walls at night, knowing the rising steam would blend with rain clouds to obscure sniper shots. When Ottoman miners finally breached a section of wall, the very mud that hampered their advance also slowed the Habsburg counterattack, turning what could have been a decisive assault into a bloody stalemate. Disease became the Ottoman silent executioner. With latrines overflowing into trenches, cholera spread faster than rumors. The Sultan's elite cavalry, useless in flooded fields, consumed precious fodder while their horses sickened. By October, the death toll from illness rivaled battle losses. Suleiman faced an agonizing choice: press the siege as winter loomed, risking starvation, or retreat and lose face. The decision was made for him when early snows blocked mountain passes behind his army, threatening to trap his forces. The retreat that followed became a nightmare. Abandoned cannons littered the roads, and freezing rains turned the Danube into a graveyard of overturned supply barges. What makes Vienna's deliverance so striking is how narrowly Christendom escaped disaster. Had the rains held off just 2 weeks longer, Ottoman sappers might have collapsed Vienna's walls. Instead, weather became the unlikeliest of saviors, proving that even the mightiest empires bowed to nature's timetable. The siege's failure didn't just preserve Habsburg Austria, it bought Europe a 150-year reprieve from Ottoman expansion. All because autumn arrived early and the heavens fought for Vienna when men alone could not. Palm Sunday, 1461, dawned with an eerie stillness over Toten field until the snow began. What started as flurries soon became a howling blizzard, the kind that swallows sound and blinds men at arm's length. For the tens of thousands of Yorkist and Lancastrian soldiers gathered there, this wasn't just bad weather, it was a force that erased the very rules of war. Imagine commanders shouting orders no one could hear, archers loosing volleys into white nothingness, and knights disoriented, swinging at shadows in the storm. The Battle of Toten, already destined to be the bloodiest clash of the Wars of the Roses, became something far stranger, a fight against the elements themselves. The snow's first victim was coordination. Lancastrian longbowmen, positioned on higher ground, unleashed their deadly arrows only for the wind to hurl them back into their own ranks. Yorkist forces advancing uphill found their footing treacherous, their plate armor slick with ice. Even the herald's banners meant to guide troops vanished behind curtains of driving snow. What should have been a battle of formations dissolved into 1,000 desperate duels, men grappling in the drifts with no sense of who held the advantage. The chaos was so complete that chroniclers later wrote of soldiers stumbling into enemy lines by accident, their visibility reduced to the length of a sword. Yet the storm didn't treat both sides equally. The Lancastrians, though initially favored by terrain, suffered more from the wind's caprice. Their arrows, meant to rain death from above, became useless as gusts blew them off course, some even embedding in the backs of their own advancing infantry. Meanwhile, the Yorkists adapted. Edward IV's men pressed forward, using the blizzard as cover to close the distance where their polearms and swords could dominate. The snow that hid them also concealed the carnage. Men fought on, unaware of the mounting dead around them until they tripped over frozen corpses. The aftermath revealed weather's cruelest trick. As temperatures plunged, the wounded, those who might have survived with treatment, succumbed to hypothermia by the thousands. The thaw that followed exposed a grim tableau. Bodies piled in ravines where retreating Lancastrians had slipped on ice, others half buried in drifts, their final expressions preserved by the cold. Toten's death toll, estimated at 28,000, wasn't just a testament to medieval brutality. it was a reminder that nature could outkill any army. What lingers about Toten isn't just the bloodshed, but the absurdity. Men who'd trained for years in swordplay and strategy found their expertise meaningless when they couldn't see 3 feet ahead. The battle's legacy isn't just in who won or lost, but in how quickly the best-laid plans unravel when the sky decides to fight back. In the end, Toten wasn't a victory of tactics. It was a lottery where the prize went to those who could endure the storm longest. And for the survivors, the lesson was clear. In war, sometimes the greatest enemy wears no armor. It falls from the sky, silent and indifferent, rewriting history one snowflake at a time. The summer of 1315 should have brought golden fields and full granaries instead. It brought ceaseless rain. Day after day, the downpours turned Europe's farmlands into swamps, drowning wheat and barley under stagnant water. Roots rotted in the ground, and what little grain survived sprouted toxic molds. Within months, the continent faced a catastrophe unlike anything in living memory, the Great Famine. But this wasn't just an agricultural disaster, it was a slow-motion unraveling of medieval society itself. Starving peasants abandoned villages to scour forests for acorns, while wolves grew bold enough to stalk the streets of Paris. And as hunger gnawed at the foundations of order, something darker emerged. Wars fought not for glory or territory, but for sacks of moldy flour. Armies, once the pride of kings, now struggled to march. Knights who'd trained for swordplay found their arms too weak to lift lances, while supply trains meant to feed thousands arrived half empty. The famine didn't just weaken soldiers, it reshaped entire campaigns. In Flanders, a pitched battle between French and Flemish forces was abruptly called off when neither side could muster enough able-bodied men. Along the Baltic coast, Teutonic knights cancelled their annual raids into Lithuania, not out of mercy, but because their horses were too emaciated to carry them. Even the vaunted English longbowmen, Europe's most feared archers, saw their draw weights reduced by hunger, their arrows falling harmlessly short. What made the famine so devastating wasn't just the lack of food, it was the domino effect of desperation. Villages that had coexisted peacefully for generations now turned on each other, launching midnight raids on neighbors' storehouses. In Lombardy, chroniclers wrote of parents abandoning children they could no longer feed, while in Ireland, entire monasteries starved to death behind their walls. When Scottish forces invaded England in 1316, they weren't met with a defending army, but with hollow-eyed villagers too weak to lift pitchforks. The invaders, scarcely better off, soon retreated not from battle, but because the land they'd come to pillage had nothing left to give. The political fallout was even more profound. Kings who'd built their legitimacy on protecting subjects now faced revolts from populations convinced the rains were divine punishment. In France, Philip V's authority crumbled as bread riots erupted in every major city. Meanwhile, the papacy scrambled to explain why God would allow such suffering, with some clergymen blaming the poor for their own starvation. The very fabric of feudalism, the idea that lords provided security in exchange for labor, began to fray as serfs realized their overlords couldn't or wouldn't feed them. Yet amid the chaos, glimmers of adaptation emerged. Coastal communities turned desperately to the sea, with herring suddenly becoming a currency more reliable than silver. In the Low Countries, farmers began experimenting with drainage systems that would later revolutionize agriculture. And perhaps most tellingly, the famine birthed Europe's first widespread poor laws. Patchwork attempts by towns to distribute grain fairly, foreshadowing the welfare systems of centuries to come. The Great Famine's true legacy lies in its exposure of medieval society's fragility. It revealed how thin the veil of civilization really was, how just 2 years of bad weather could reduce proud kingdoms to scavengers. And it set the stage for an even greater catastrophe, the Black Death, which would strike a generation later with a populace already weakened by hunger. Together, these crises proved that in the medieval world, climate wasn't just backdrop. It was the invisible hand that could topple thrones, rewrite social contracts, and remind humanity that for all its castles and cathedrals, it was still at the mercy of the skies. Dawn broke over Hastings on October 14, 1066, with an omen, a stiff wind blowing inland from the English Channel. For Duke William of Normandy, this wasn't just a breeze, it was about to become the most debated meteorological phenomenon in medieval history. As his archers nocked their first arrows, legend claims the wind suddenly shifted, carrying Norman volleys farther, and with deadly precision toward Harold Godwinson's shield wall atop Senlac Hill. Whether divine intervention or sheer luck, that gust didn't just change arrow trajectories, it altered the course of English history. The wind's role at Hastings lives in that hazy space between fact and folklore. Norman chroniclers, writing years later, insisted heaven itself favored William, while English accounts dismissed it as bad luck. Modern historians remain divided. Some argue the wind shift was exaggerated to justify divine right, while others point to coastal weather patterns that indeed could have altered arrow flights. But here's what's undeniable: the psychological impact was real. Picture Harold's housecarls, shields raised against a sky suddenly darkened with arrows, watching as shafts that should have fallen short now thudded into their ranks. Morale, that invisible backbone of any army, began to crack under the strain of believing even the elements fought against them. William's real genius lay in exploiting this perception. When rumors spread that he'd been killed mid-battle, the Duke famously lifted his helmet to prove otherwise, but lesser known is how he used the wind to amplify his rallying cry. With a breeze at his back, his voice carried farther across the chaos, convincing wavering troops their cause still lived. Meanwhile, Harold's forces, shouting uphill against the same wind, found their orders lost in the gale. Weather didn't just influence tactics, it became a tool of psychological warfare, magnifying doubt and momentum in equal measure. The aftermath cemented the legend. Bayeux tapestry weavers immortalized the wind as curling lines bending Norman arrows, a visual metaphor for divine favor. William's propagandists spun the story into proof of his rightful kingship, while defeated Saxons whispered of cursed skies. This battle, more than any other, shows how medieval minds blurred the line between weather and destiny. A single gust became either God's will or nature's caprice, depending on who told the tale. Hastings' true lesson isn't about whether the wind shifted, it's about how deeply weather was woven into the medieval worldview. For warriors who saw omens in bird flights and harvests, a favorable breeze wasn't just physics, it was providence. And in that moment when Norman arrows flew unnaturally far, both sides glimpsed a terrifying possibility that history might turn not on courage or strategy, but on something as fleeting as the wind's whisper. The dense fog clinging to the slopes above Lake Egerie on November 15, 1315, wasn't just weather, it was Switzerland's secret weapon. As Leopold I of Austria led his heavily armored knights through the narrow Morgarten Pass, visibility dropped to near zero. What the Habsburg forces didn't see until it was too late were the peasant militias of Schwyz and Uri lurking above, their positions erased by the mist. When the Swiss finally struck, rolling boulders and tree trunks down the slopes before charging with halberds, the Austrians had no time to form defensive lines. The fog that morning didn't just obscure the battlefield, it transformed a ragtag group of mountain farmers into an unstoppable guerrilla force. This was nature's great equalizer in medieval warfare. Unlike rain or snow, which affected both sides, fog favored whoever knew the terrain best. At Morgarten, Swiss fighters used cattle paths invisible to invaders, emerging like ghosts to strike before vanishing back into the whiteout. The Austrians, trained for open field battles, found their cavalry useless on slippery slopes they couldn't see. Even their crossbowmen struggled without clear sightlines. Their bolts flew wildly, sometimes hitting their own panicked comrades. The fog didn't just conceal the Swiss attack, it amplified the chaos, turning disciplined formations into disoriented mobs. By battle's end, over 1,500 Habsburg soldiers lay dead, many having stumbled blindly into the lake's icy waters. Smaller conflicts exploited fog's advantages even more creatively. In the Scottish Highlands, clans timed raids for a thick sea fogs rolling inland, to mask their movements between glens. Welsh longbowmen under Owain Glyndwr used morning mists to creep within 80 yards of English encampments, close enough for their arrows to punch through plate armor before sentries could react. Even naval battles weren't immune. During the 100 Years' War, Castilian ships vanished into Atlantic fog banks, only to reappear suddenly alongside English vessels for devastating boarding actions. The true brilliance of fog tactics lay in their psychological toll. Imagine being a medieval soldier hearing shouts and clanging metal through the mist, never knowing from which direction the next blow would come. Chroniclers wrote of armies firing arrows at phantom shapes that turned out to be shrubs, or knights charging friendlies in the confusion. Some commanders tried countermeasures. Hungarian light cavalry tied bells to their gear so they wouldn't lose each other, while Venetian admirals used coordinated horn blasts to maintain formation. But when the fog grew thick enough, even these measures failed. What makes these battles so fascinating is how they upended medieval military doctrine. Fog rendered the era's most prized assets, heavy cavalry, massed archers, siege engines, nearly useless. Instead, it rewarded flexibility, local knowledge, and improvisation. A well-timed fog could turn shepherds into strategists and castles into death traps, proving that sometimes the best weapon wasn't steel, but the weather's uncanny ability to make the familiar terrain feel like alien ground. In an age where armies fought for visibility, both literal and metaphorical, the thickest fog could be the ultimate cloak of invisibility. Crossing a medieval river was never just about getting wet, it was a gamble with nature itself. Picture Frederick Barbarossa's mighty crusading army in 1190, strung out along the banks of the Salef River in Anatolia. What should have been a routine ford turned apocalyptic when upstream rains transformed the shallow crossing into a raging torrent. Knights in 60 pounds of armor sank like stones, their war horses flailing helplessly in the current. Supply wagons meant to feed thousands tumbled end over end, smashing into rocks as the waters rose. Within hours, the Holy Roman Emperor's carefully planned campaign lay in ruins, not by Saracen blades, but by a river that had been knee-deep the day before. These disasters weren't just bad luck, they revealed a brutal truth of medieval logistics. Rivers might appear on maps as neat blue lines, but in reality, they were living, unpredictable forces. A dry summer could lull commanders into complacency, only for autumn storms to send walls of water crashing down mountain valleys. The Mongols learned this the hard way in 1241, when attempting to cross the swollen Sojo River in Hungary. Their famed mounted archers, masters of the open steppe, found themselves trapped on collapsing ice floes, their mobility useless against the current's pull. Even the Thames, so peaceful today, claimed lives during King John's reign when a flash flood drowned his baggage train during a hasty retreat from rebel barons. Timing was everything. Seasoned armies watched for nature's warning signs, the distant rumble of thunder upstream, birds fleeing riverbanks, or the telltale murkiness of silt-laden water signaling rising flow. The wisest commanders employed local guides who knew which fords turned lethal first, or built pontoon bridges with ropes to prevent swept-away planks. But even precautions failed when nature overruled. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, Russian princes chased retreating Mongols across seemingly safe shallows, only to be ambushed mid-crossing when the enemy doubled back, using the river itself to split and isolate their forces. The cruelest irony, these waterways that killed also saved. During the 100 Years' War, French armies repeatedly escaped English longbowmen by retreating across rain-swollen rivers that halted pursuit. In 1485, Henry Tudor's march to Bosworth Field succeeded only because autumnal floods delayed his rival, Richard III's forces, long enough for rebel reinforcements to arrive. Rivers didn't take sides, they punished the unprepared and rewarded those who respected their power. What made these crossings so treacherous wasn't just the water's force, but the chaos it created. A disrupted formation could be as deadly as drowning. Imagine armored knights dismounting to ford a stream, only for sudden currents to scatter them vulnerable and separated from their horses when enemy archers appeared on the far bank. Or picture infantry holding shields overhead in waist-deep water, their weapons useless until they stumbled ashore, exhausted and off balance. The crossing itself became a battle, one where the enemy was invisible, indifferent, and utterly relentless. Barbarossa's fate stands as history's starkest warning. The emperor who defied popes and Italian city-states met his end not in glorious combat, but struggling against a river's grip. His death scattered the Third Crusade's leadership, altering the course of the Holy Land's wars. It's a reminder that in medieval warfare, the greatest generals weren't just fighting men. They were wrestling with geography, meteorology, and the simple, terrifying physics of water in motion. Rivers didn't care about crowns or crusades. They flowed where they pleased, and armies crossed at their peril. The afternoon sun hung low over Crécy en Ponthieu on August 26, 1346, its blinding rays slanting directly into the eyes of the Genoese crossbowmen as they struggled to reload. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Edward III of England had chosen his position with eerie precision, placing his longbowmen atop a gentle slope with the setting sun at their backs. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in turning celestial mechanics into battlefield dominance. The Genoese, hired by France as elite mercenaries, found their famed crossbows nearly useless as sunlight glinted off their steel strings, obscuring targets just long enough for English arrows to find their mark. Crossbowmen of this era faced an agonizing reload process, cranking the weapon with a windlass while standing exposed. Normally, their pavai shields offered protection, but at Crécy, the sun's angle rendered them ineffective. Imagine squinting against a golden haze, your vision swimming as arrows materialize from the glare. The English, meanwhile, loosed volleys at a rate of 10 arrows per minute, their yew bows unaffected by the light's treachery. Even the wind cooperated, carrying shafts farther downhill while the Genoese bolts fell short, their trajectories disrupted by the need to shoot upward into the glare. Edward's foresight went deeper than just positioning. His archers had spent years training in all conditions, including shooting into sunlight, a detail often overlooked in accounts of their dominance. French chroniclers later claimed their crossbowmen's strings had been weakened by an earlier rainstorm, but the real weakness was tactical. Philip VI of France, impatient and overconfident, ordered a premature attack without letting the Genoese reposition. The result was a slaughterhouse of tangled formations, panicked horses, and men stumbling blindly into arrow storms they couldn't even see coming. What makes Crécy revolutionary isn't just the victory, it's how it exposed the fragility of medieval military doctrine. The French, wedded to chivalric ideals of knightly charges, dismissed environmental factors as trivial. Edward, by contrast, treated the very rotation of the earth as a weapon. His archers didn't just outshoot the Genos, they outthought them, using astronomy as ruthlessly as steel. The lesson echoed for centuries. In warfare, the heavens aren't neutral observers. Their participants and commanders who ignore their whims do so at their peril. Charlemagne's march toward Zaragoza in 778 should have been a triumph. His Frankish army, the mightiest in Europe, had crossed the Pyrenees unchallenged. But as summer scorched the Iberian plains, his campaign faced an enemy no sword could strike: drought. Wells ran dry, streams evaporated into cracked earth, and the very air seemed to steal moisture from men's lips. Horses collapsed first, their ribs protruding as supply wagons emptied of water barrels. Then came the whispers among foot soldiers, voices hoarse from thirst, questioning why they'd followed an emperor into this barren trap. By the time Charlemagne reached Zaragoza's walls, his army wasn't laying siege, it was barely clinging to life. This wasn't just hardship, it was a logistical nightmare. Medieval armies required staggering amounts of water, not just for drinking but for cooking, blacksmithing, and treating wounds. A single knight's warhorse could drain 4 gallons daily, while dysentery outbreaks common in dehydrated camps demanded even more to stave off death. Without reliable sources, discipline crumbled. Chroniclers tell of Frankish soldiers deserting under cover of night to seek distant springs, while others mutinied openly, demanding retreat. The irony was brutal. Charlemagne, who'd built an empire through sheer force of will, found his authority evaporating like the morning dew. Zaragoza's defenders watched this unraveling with grim satisfaction. Their city, fed by the Ebro River, had water to spare, while outside their gates, the Franks licked parched lips and stared at mud-caked helmets too heavy to lift. When news arrived of a revolt back in Saxony, Charlemagne had no choice but to order a withdrawal. The retreat through the Roncesvalles Pass, later immortalized in song as Roland's last stand, was less a military maneuver than a desperate scramble for survival. Thirst, not Saracen blades, had broken the Carolingian war machine. Similar scenes played out across the medieval world. During the Third Crusade, Richard the Lionheart lost a third of his army to dehydration marching from Acre to Jaffa, a stretch where temperatures hit 120 degrees. In the Baltic, Teutonic knights abandoned sieges when nearby lakes turned saline from overuse, their men vomiting from drinking tainted water. Even the Mongols, masters of mobile warfare, sometimes retreated when steppe rivers dried up, their ponies growing too weak to carry riders. The lesson was clear. In an era without tanker trucks or desalination plants, water wasn't just a resource, it was the pulse of an army. Commanders who ignored its rhythms risked more than defeat. They risked watching their forces dissolve like mirages in the desert heat. Charlemagne's failure at Zaragoza became a cautionary tale, proving that the greatest threat to conquest wasn't always the enemy on the walls, but the sky withholding rain and the earth refusing to yield its last precious drops. The river Forth twisted like a serpent through the marshes near Stirling in September 1297, its tides dictating a rhythm only locals understood. When the English army arrived heavy with armored knights and confident in their numerical superiority, they saw just a bridge and shallow crossings. What they didn't see was the trap William Wallace and Andrew Moray had woven into the very landscape. The Scots knew something their enemies didn't. The Forth wasn't just a river, it was a clock, its tidal surges swallowing the causeway at precise intervals, leaving no room for error. As the English vanguard marched onto the narrow wooden bridge that morning, the waters seemed calm. But Wallace's scouts had been watching the moon's phases. They knew the tide would turn when the enemy was mid-crossing. Sure enough, as the first English knights reached the far bank, the Forth began its silent rise. Currents that had been ankle-deep at dawn swelled to waist height, cutting off reinforcements while isolating those already across. The Scots, positioned on firmer ground, waited until the critical moment when the tide reached its peak, and the English were split in two before launching their assault. The real brilliance lay in the terrain's manipulation. Wallace's forces had spent weeks studying the marsh's quirks, where the ground looked solid but hid sucking bogs, which ridges stayed dry even at high tide. As the English floundered, their heavy armor became a death sentence. Knights who strayed from the causeway sank to their thighs in muck, helpless as Scottish spearmen picked them off. Meanwhile, the rising waters forced the rear guard into a bottleneck on the bridge itself, where their numbers meant nothing. Panic spread as men realized the river was rising faster than they could retreat, their orderly ranks collapsing into a stampede of splintering wood and drowning horses. Weather played its part too. A late summer rainstorm the night before had softened the marshes further, creating deceptively green patches that gave way underfoot. The English, accustomed to the firm chalklands of southern Britain, had no experience with such terrain. Even their archers were useless. The damp air loosened bowstrings, while the wind carried their arrows harmlessly off course. Wallace, by contrast, had chosen weapons suited to the conditions: long spears to skewer trapped knights from a safe distance, and lightweight axes for close quarters, fighting where agility mattered more than brute strength. The aftermath revealed the battle's true masterstroke. As the tide receded, it revealed hundreds of English bodies half buried in mud, their expensive armor now just debris for the scavengers. Stirling Bridge wasn't just a victory, it was a lesson in environmental warfare. Wallace hadn't defeated the English with sheer force. He'd let the river do half the work, proving that in medieval combat, knowledge of local weather and tides could outweigh even the mightiest army. The battle's legacy echoes beyond history books, a reminder that sometimes the greatest general isn't the one with the most soldiers, but the one who listens closest to the land's whispers. The year 536 dawned with a sun so dim it cast no shadows, a phenomenon recorded from Constantinople to China. A mysterious volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, had flung millions of tons of ash into the stratosphere, creating a veil that plunged the northern hemisphere into an 18-month winter. Summer frosts withered crops overnight, while eerie blue sunsets signaled something deeply wrong with the world. This wasn't just a bad harvest season. It was a climate catastrophe that reshaped the course of history, setting the stage for medieval Europe's turbulent birth. Famine spread like a plague. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of peasants boiling weeds and tree bark for sustenance, while Irish chronicles noted bread failed entirely for years. Societies already strained by the collapse of Roman infrastructure found their resilience tested beyond breaking point. The Lombards, fleeing starvation in Scandinavia, poured into Italy. The Avars, driven from the Asian steppes by failing grasslands, pressed westward. Even the Anglo-Saxon migrations to Britain accelerated as Germanic tribes abandoned frozen fields. These weren't random movements, they were desperate surges of populations fleeing a climate emergency, crashing into established kingdoms like waves against crumbling cliffs. The political aftershocks lasted centuries. The Eastern Roman Empire, already battling plague, saw its tax base evaporate as farms failed. Justinian the Great's dreams of reuniting Rome's former glory founded not on battlefields but in empty granaries. Meanwhile, the Franks and Goths, better adapted to decentralized survival, gained strength as centralized states faltered. The volcanic winter didn't just kill crops, it killed old political orders, clearing space for the feudal systems that would define the medieval era. What makes 536 so pivotal is how it exposed pre-medieval Europe's fragility. Without robust trade networks or food storage systems, societies had no buffer against ecological shocks. The years of darkness taught harsh lessons about preparedness, lessons that echoed in medieval manner, estates with their diversified crops and local food reserves. The catastrophe even influenced warfare itself. Future armies would prioritize securing supply lines after witnessing how climate could accomplish what no enemy army could: the total collapse of logistics. This was nature's ultimate power play, a single eruption rewriting human destiny. When we study medieval battles shaped by weather, we're seeing the echoes of 536, a reminder that behind every clash of swords lay older, deeper struggles against a world that could turn hostile without warning. The medieval world was born in volcanic winter, and its wars would forever bear the frost's imprint. The summer of 1361 scorched Gotland with a heatwave so intense it cracked the island's clay soils. When King Valdemar IV of Denmark's invasion force landed that July, the farmers and merchants defending Visby faced an impossible choice: don their heaviest armor and risk heatstroke, or fight unprotected against professional soldiers. Many chose the armor. It was a decision that turned the battlefield into an oven, their bodies literally cooking inside steel shells as temperatures soared past 100 degrees. The Battle of Visby wasn't just a military defeat. It was a grim lesson in how weather could weaponize even the tools meant to save lives. Archaeologists later uncovered mass graves filled with skeletons still clad in chainmail, their bones telling a silent story of suffering. Some showed signs of frantic last moments, fingers broken from clawing at helmet visors in a desperate bid for air, rib cages warped from the strain of labored breathing. The heat's impact went beyond discomfort. It crippled the defenders' ability to fight. Sweat-slicked hands fumbled weapons, vision blurred from dehydration, and the sheer weight of armor turned every step into agony. Meanwhile, the Danish invaders, though equally sweltering, had timed their attack for midday when the sun was highest, knowing their lighter-equipped troops could endure longer than men encased in layered steel. The real tragedy lay in the asymmetry of preparation. Gotland's militia, accustomed to brief coastal skirmishes, had no concept of heat management. Their armor, some decades old and designed for northern European winters, trapped heat like a forge. By contrast, Valdemar's mercenaries came from Germany's warmer regions, where soldiers knew to soak padded gambesons in water before battle for evaporative cooling. They'd also learned to fight in shifts, rotating frontline troops to prevent exhaustion, a tactic the isolated Gotlanders, fighting for their homes with no reserves, couldn't replicate. Visby's aftermath revealed nature's cruelest irony. Many defenders died not from Danish swords, but from collapsing mid-charge, their hearts giving out under the strain. Others, disoriented by heatstroke, wandered into enemy lines or drowned in their own sweat after face planting in the dirt. The battle's archaeological record shows something startling: more trauma to the back of skulls than the front, suggesting men were fleeing when struck down, perhaps overcome by the heat before blades ever reached them. This wasn't just a battle lost to superior numbers, it was a massacre by meteorology. The lesson echoed through medieval Europe. Armor that could deflect arrows became a death sentence under a blazing sun. Future armies would adapt, designing lighter gear for summer campaigns and training troops to recognize heatstroke's early signs. But for Visby's defenders, that knowledge came too late, their bones forever testifying to the day when the weather itself chose sides. The sea has always been the most fickle of battlefields, where a single gust could topple empires or save civilizations. Long before the Spanish Armada met its fate, another great naval showdown proved just how decisively the winds could rewrite history. In the summer of 718, Constantinople's massive sea walls trembled as the Arab Umayyad fleet closed in, their ships packed with enough men to overwhelm the Byzantine capital once and for all. But the defenders had a secret ally, the fierce northerly winds known to locals as the Etesians. As Arab sails strained against the gales, the Byzantines unleashed their most devastating weapon, Greek fire, its liquid flames carried by the wind directly into the enemy fleet. The combination was catastrophic. Flaming ships, pushed back by the unrelenting winds, became drifting infernos that consumed the entire invasion force in hours. This wasn't just a victory, it was weather warfare at its most brutal. The Mediterranean's winds didn't just shape battles, they dictated the rise and fall of naval powers. Venice's dominance in the 13th century hinged on its admirals' mastery of seasonal winds, timing campaigns to ride the summer mistral from Dalmatia to the Levant, while avoiding the deadly Bora gusts that could smash galleys against rocky coasts. Meanwhile, the Norse sagas tell of Viking longships bypassing fortified harbors by waiting for the perfect offshore wind to beach silently on undefended shores. These weren't just tactics, they were marriages between human ambition and atmospheric whims. Even the smallest weather shifts could unravel grand strategies. During the War of the Sicilian Vespers in 1282, Angevin and Aragonese fleets watched helplessly as an unexpected calm stranded their ships within arrow range of each other oarsmen, collapsing from exhaustion as the battle stretched into days without wind to fill sails. The stalemate only broke when a sudden evening breeze allowed the Aragonese to flank their opponents, proving that in naval warfare, patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a matter of reading the sky's subtle cues. The ultimate test of wind's power came during the Genos-Venetian Wars, where entire battles hinged on which admiral could best tack against the breeze. In 1258, a clever Venetian commander lured the Genos into the Adriatic's narrow channels, where shifting katabatic winds blew his lighter ships straight into the enemy's vulnerable rear. The result, a rout so complete it shifted control of Mediterranean trade routes for a generation. What made wind so fearsome wasn't just its force, it was its silence. Unlike storms that gave warning with dark clouds, a rogue gust could strike without mercy. English chronicles describe Henry V's invasion fleet in 1415 scattered by a midnight squall, ships vanishing into darkness as if swallowed by the sea itself. And when the Hanseatic League's warships pursued Danish rebels in 1370, a sudden wind shift ran their vessels aground on sandbars, turning hunters into stranded prey. These weren't just meteorological footnotes, they were pivotal moments where nature overruled human plans. From the Baltic's icy gales to the Mediterranean's capricious zephyrs, wind didn't just fill sails, it filled history books with tales of hubris humbled and underdogs elevated. For every admiral who prayed for fair winds, there was another who learned too late that the sky answers to no one. Dawn broke over Grunwald on July 15, 1410 with an eerie quiet, a thick, clinging mist that swallowed sound and sight alike. For the Teutonic Knights, this should have been just another morning in their campaign against the Polish-Lithuanian alliance. But in the fog's embrace, King W. Ladislaw Jagiello's forces were already moving, their advance masked by nature's own smokescreen. What unfolded wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in using weather as a weapon of deception. The same mist that obscured the Teutonic scouts' view also concealed the Polish-Lithuanian flanking maneuvers, turning what should have been a straightforward clash into a deadly ambush on a continental scale. The brilliance of Jagiello's plan lay in its simplicity. While the Teutonic Knights formed up in their traditional battle lines, expecting a head-on confrontation, the Allied forces used the fog to stretch their formations wider than the enemy could see. Lithuanian light cavalry, silent as shadows, slipped around the Teutonic right flank, while Polish heavy knights advanced at angles the mist rendered invisible until it was too late. Chroniclers later wrote of the Teutonic Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen turning in his saddle, only to see spectral shapes resolve into charging horsemen barely 50 yards away, a nightmare made real by the weather's complicity. But the fog's impact went beyond just concealment. It disrupted the Teutonic chain of command at the worst possible moment. Trumpet calls meant to coordinate movements became muffled and distorted, leaving some units charging forward while others held back, convinced they'd misheard orders. Crossbowmen, deprived of clear sight lines, loosed volleys into empty whiteness, wasting precious bolts while enemy infantry closed the distance unscathed. Even the famed Teutonic heavy cavalry, usually unstoppable in open terrain, found their charge blunted as horses balked at charging into the opaque unknown. The Allies, by contrast, had prepared for the fog's challenges. Jagiello's scouts had marked the terrain in advance, using shallow streams and stands of trees as natural guides. Lithuanian archers, accustomed to hunting in Baltic forests, could estimate distances through the mist by sound alone, their arrows finding targets the Teutonics never saw coming. And when the sun finally burned through around midday, the revelation was catastrophic for the order. Their once proud formations were now encircled, their reserves already committed to phantom threats that had existed only in the mist's deception. What makes Grunwald extraordinary isn't just the victory, but how completely weather rewrote the battle's opening act. The same conditions that paralyzed the Teutonic knights empowered their enemies, proving once again that in medieval warfare, understanding the environment wasn't just helpful, it was the difference between legendary triumph and humiliating defeat. The fog that morning didn't just obscure the field, it leveled it, stripping away the Teutonics' technological and disciplinary advantages until all that remained was brutal, close-quarters chaos where local knowledge and adaptability ruled supreme. Grunwald's legacy endures as a testament to nature's impartiality. The mist favored not the strongest or most pious, but the commander who listened closest to the land's whispers. For the Teutonic Order, it was a crushing blow from which they never fully recovered. For Poland and Lithuania, it was the birth of a legend, one written not just in blood and steel, but in the fleeting, formless embrace of a morning fog that changed the course of Eastern European history. The rhythm of medieval warfare followed the seasons as faithfully as farmers sowing their fields. Summer wasn't just the ideal time for battle, it was often the only time armies could move at all. Imagine trying to lead thousands of men and horses across countryside turned to mud by autumn rains, or through snowdrifts that swallowed supply wagons whole. Roads that were dusty highways in July became impassable quagmires by November, stranding armies far from home with dwindling food and morale. This wasn't just inconvenience, it was existential. Without reliable forage, horses starved. Without dry ground, siege engines bogged down. And without clear skies, scouts couldn't spot ambushes or navigate unfamiliar terrain. The logistics of winter campaigning bordered on suicidal. Take the humble haystack, something most modern minds wouldn't associate with military strategy. In winter, grass stopped growing, meaning cavalry units needed to transport or requisition every mouthful of fodder for their mounts. A single warhorse consumed 25 pounds of hay daily. Multiply that by thousands, and you've got a supply train longer than some armies. Then there was human sustenance. Grain stores from the autumn harvest had to last until spring, making foraging in frozen fields a fool's errand. French chronicles from the 100 Years' War tell of English raiders burning barns not to spite farmers, but to deny French armies winter quarters where they might replenish supplies. Weather's impact went deeper than just stomachs and saddlebags. Metal armor, already burdensome, became a liability in freezing temperatures. Plate mail conducted cold like a butcher's icebox, risking frostbite where it touched skin. Leather straps stiffened until they snapped, while sword grips grew slick with condensation from trembling hands. Even the famed English longbow, the superweapon of its day, lost effectiveness as freezing sap made bowstrings brittle and arrow flights damp. Contrast this with summer campaigns, where dry conditions kept gear functional and rivers ran low enough to ford without hypothermia. There were exceptions, of course, but they proved the rule. The Mongols thrived in winter because their entire way of life revolved around surviving the steppes' brutal cold. Their ponies dug through snow for grass, their layered fur clothing outperformed European mail, and their mobility let them exploit frozen rivers as highways. When Subutai invaded Hungary in 1241, he didn't just endure winter, he weaponized it, timing his attack for when European knights would be least prepared. Similarly, Russian princes learned to fight in snow because they had no choice. Alexander Nevsky's victory on Lake Peipus hinged on luring Teutonic knights onto ice they couldn't navigate. The seasonal pause reshaped warfare in unexpected ways. Winter became the time for repairing armor, training recruits, and crucially negotiating. Many truces were signed not because of battlefield losses, but because both sides recognized the coming snows would stall operations anyway. Castles under siege might get months of reprieve as attackers withdrew to winter quarters, giving defenders time to repair walls or stockpile food. Even the rhythm of pillaging followed nature's lead. Raiders like the Vikings timed coastal attacks for early autumn, when harvests were gathered but before storms made sailing treacherous. This cyclical warfare left its mark on medieval culture. The very word campaign comes from the Latin campania, meaning open country suitable for summer operations. Chivalric romances overflow with battles fought amid golden fields and blooming orchards, not just poetic license, but reflections of military reality. When exceptions like the Battle of Toten occurred in blizzards, chroniclers treated them as supernatural portents. So unnatural was winter combat. The seasons didn't just influence medieval wars, they dictated their very possibility, turning warm weather into as vital a weapon as any sword or siege engine. Kings might command armies, but it was the earth itself that decided when they could march. The Crusader army that marched toward Nicopolis in 1396 was a pageant of medieval might, knights from France, Burgundy, and Hungary gleaming in polished plate armor, their banners bright against the Balkan sky. But beneath the pageantry lurked a fatal miscalculation. These were men bred for the damp chill of northern Europe, now trudging through the suffocating heat of a Bulgarian August in full battle gear. Their armor, engineered to deflect sword blows, became personal ovens under the relentless sun. Chainmail conducted heat like a blacksmith's apron, while padded gambesons beneath trapped sweat until the fabric chafed skin raw. By midday, the Crusaders weren't just uncomfortable, they were dying. Chroniclers tell of knights collapsing mid-march, their bodies failing not from wounds but from heat stroke. Horses reared and buckled under riders suddenly too delirious to hold reins. The army's pace slowed to a crawl as men stripped off armor piece by piece, abandoning precious protection along the roadside. What should have been a disciplined advance became a straggling procession of heat-maddened soldiers, their water skins long emptied, their faces blistered under helmet visors. The Ottomans, watching from the hills, must have marveled at the spectacle. Europe's finest warriors, brought low not by arrows or scimitars, but by their own refusal to respect the climate. The Crusaders' fatal flaw wasn't just ignorance, it was hubris. They dismissed local warnings about summer campaigning, convinced their divine mission would shield them from earthly discomforts. Their commanders, nobles who'd never marched farther than a tournament field, scoffed at suggestions to travel at night or in lighter gear. Even water discipline collapsed. Knights drained their reserves early, assuming they'd seize Ottoman wells upon arrival. Instead, they found them poisoned or destroyed, leaving men to lick dew from grass blades. By the time Sultan Bayezid's forces engaged them near Nicopolis, the Crusaders were already a shadow army, dehydrated, disoriented, and utterly unprepared for battle. What followed was less a clash of arms than a clinical dissection of meteorological arrogance. The Ottomans, accustomed to the heat, fought in loose linen tunics and leather lamellar armor that breathed. Their Sipahi cavalry circled the sluggish Crusader flanks like wolves around exhausted prey, while Janissary archers picked off stragglers with methodical precision. The Crusaders' famed heavy cavalry charges, so devastating on cooler fields, faltered after 50 yards as overheated war horses stumbled and riders slid from saddles slick with sweat. Even the knights who reached Ottoman lines found their sword arms too weak for more than a few strikes before muscles cramped in the withering heat. Nicopolis stands as one of history's starkest examples of environmental humility. The Crusaders didn't lose because they lacked courage or skill. They lost because they refused to adapt. Their armor, their tactics, even their very concept of warfare belonged to a different climate. In the end, the battle was decided long before the first arrow flew, on a sun-baked road where pride melted faster than the wax sealing their abandoned water casks. The Ottomans didn't just defeat the Crusaders, they let the Balkan summer do it for them. The sky wasn't just a backdrop for medieval armies, it was a parchment scrawled with divine messages, every cloud and gust heavy with meaning. When Charlemagne's forces spotted a rainbow arching over the battlefield at Pavia in 773, chroniclers swore it was God's banner unfurled in their favor. Days later, their victory over the Lombards cemented the omen in military lore, but flip the script and you'd find generals like Richard the Lionheart halting entire campaigns because an eclipse darkened the noonday sun, an unmistakable warning from heaven. These weren't mere superstitions, they were a survival tactic in an era when weather's whims could mean life or death for thousands. Take the humble weather vane perched atop every medieval church. Soldiers scrutinized its shifts like ancient meteorologists, believing a sudden east wind might carry the breath of angels or demons. Before the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, French knights took heart when the wind turned to face their German foes, interpreting it as divine favor. Their subsequent rout of Emperor Otto's forces only deepened the legend. On the flip side, a thunderclap at the wrong moment could unravel an army's nerve. During the siege of Château-Gaillard in 1203, a lightning strike shattered the flagpole of the attacking French, sending superstitious troops into retreat despite outnumbering the defenders 10-1. Some omens crossed cultural lines with eerie consistency. Both Norse sagas and Arab chronicles speak of blood rains, crimson-hued downpours caused by dust storms or algae, interpreted as portents of coming slaughter. When such a rain fell before the Battle of Ager Sanguinis in 1119, Crusader and Saracen alike saw it as proof their god destined them for victory. The resulting massacre, which claimed 7,000 lives, only fed the myth. Even celestial events became tactical tools. During the Reconquista, Spanish commanders timed attacks to coincide with the lucky crescent moon phases revered by their Moorish enemies, exploiting their opponents' reluctance to fight under waning omens. The line between faith and meteorology blurred in fascinating ways. English archers at Crecy whispered prayers to Saint Medard, the patron of good harvests and by extension, fair weather for bowstrings. Burgundian knights carried relics said to ward off hailstorms, while Byzantine navies employed rainmakers, holy men who claimed to calm squalls with chants. When these measures failed, the explanations grew creative. After a tempest scattered his invasion fleet in 1202, King John of England blamed it on a curse placed by exiled monks. Perhaps the most poignant example comes from the Baltic Crusades, where Teutonic knights marched under banners embroidered with weather saints. Their chronicles describe desperate attempts to read God's will in every snowfall and fog bank, a practice that backfired spectacularly at the Battle of Derb in 1260, when mistaking a sundog for an angelic sign led to a disastrous charge into swampland. The lesson was clear. In war, as in farming, medieval minds saw weather not as random chance but as the visible hand of providence, a force to be interpreted, appeased, and sometimes catastrophically misread. Medieval commanders didn't just pray for good weather, they engineered solutions to outsmart it. Take the English longbowmen, masters of turning meteorological adversity into advantage. Before battle, they'd coat their bowstrings in beeswax or hide them under helmets to keep them dry, ensuring their lethal range remained intact even in downpours. But waterproofing was just the beginning. Smart leaders studied cloud formations, tracked migratory bird patterns, and consulted farmers about seasonal winds, turning folk wisdom into battlefield intelligence. When Henry V planned his Normandy campaign, he didn't just count soldiers. He pored over sailors' logs to pinpoint the channel's least treacherous crossing season. Logistics became a science of anticipating nature's curveballs. The Mongols, for instance, timed their movements around the freeze-thaw cycles of the Eurasian steppes. Frozen ground meant their ponies could gallop unimpeded, while spring thaws turned enemy territories into impassable bogs. They even carried dehydrated milk and blood as emergency rations, a primitive but effective solution to sudden blizzards that left other armies starving. Meanwhile, Mediterranean admirals like Genoa's Andrea Doria kept detailed wind calendars, refusing to sail when the violent Leipzig winds churned the Tyrrhenian Sea into a maelstrom. Siege warfare demanded its own meteorological ingenuity. Crusader engineers building trebuchets at Acre wrapped their torsion ropes in oiled cloth to prevent dampness from loosening tension. Defenders countered by waiting for rainstorms to launch sorties, knowing attackers' crossbow strings would slacken. Some castle garrisons went further during the siege of Kenilworth. Rebels reportedly greased their own walls during frosts, turning approaching ladders into deadly slides. Even something as simple as camp placement revealed strategic depth. Richard the Lionheart always pitched tents on elevated ground, not just for visibility, but to avoid the dysentery bred in lowland marshes after rains. The true masters, though, were those who turned weather into psychological warfare. At the Battle of Lake Trasimene, Hannibal, though not medieval, inspired generations by luring Romans into a fog-shrouded valley where visibility dropped to arm's length. Centuries later, Scottish clans used Highland mist similarly, staging ghostly apparitions with torches to make their numbers seem legion. Savvy commanders even manipulated their own troops' perceptions. During the Wars of the Roses, Edward IV allegedly delayed attacks until sunlight gleamed off enemy armor, making their forces appear more formidable, then struck when clouds rolled in to dim the effect. What separated legendary generals from the rest wasn't just bravery or tactics, but their willingness to learn from shepherds, sailors, and almanacs. They understood that in an era without satellites, survival meant reading the land's subtle cues, whether that meant stocking spare horseshoes for muddy trails or calculating how moonlight on snow could reveal night marches. Their innovations remind us that medieval warfare wasn't just clashes of steel. but a chess game where the board itself changed with every shift in the wind. The waters of the Golden Horn should have been Constantinople's impenetrable shield on that fateful April night in 1453. For centuries, the Byzantines had relied on the harbor's natural defenses, its narrow entrance sealed by a massive iron chain, its currents treacherous to unfamiliar navigators. But as Mehmed II's Ottoman fleet approached, something eerie happened. The winds died. The Bosphorus, notorious for its swirling currents, fell still as a mirror. This wasn't just a quiet evening. It was a meteorological anomaly that would crack open the last bastion of the Roman Empire. Under cover of that unnatural calm, Ottoman crews did the impossible. They greased logs with animal fat, laid them across the hills of Galata, and hauled 70 warships overland under moonlight. The Byzantines awoke to a nightmare. Mehmed's galleys now floated inside their supposedly impregnable harbor, bypassing the chain entirely. The stillness that had seemed like a blessing became their undoing. Without wind to fill sails, Byzantine relief ships couldn't maneuver to intercept. Even the harbor's usual chop, which might have swamped the Ottomans' makeshift rollers, was absent, as if the sea itself had conspired against the city. The deeper tragedy lay in the timing. Just weeks earlier, spring storms had ravaged Mehmed's naval preparations, sinking supply ships and delaying the siege. The Byzantines had taken it as divine favor until the weather's capricious shift. Now, those same waters that had once protected them became a highway for invasion. Ottoman cannon emplacements, previously blocked by the chain, now had clear lines of fire to the city's vulnerable northern walls. The psychological blow was equally devastating. Defenders watching from the ramparts saw their last geographic advantage evaporate overnight, not by enemy engineering, but by the absence of the very winds and waves they'd trusted for 1,000 years. Historians debate whether Mehmed anticipated this meteorological luck or simply seized it. His admirals certainly knew the Bosphorus's moods. Local fishermen had long whispered of rare windless nights when the strait turned to glass. But the real lesson lies in how fragility hides beneath routine. The Byzantines hadn't neglected their defenses. They just never imagined conditions so precise would align against them. It's the same blindness that doomed the Spanish Armada a century later, a reliance on weather patterns so consistent their failure seemed unthinkable. Constantinople's fall wasn't just about gunpowder or numbers. It was about a single, windless night that let history pivot. The Ottomans didn't just conquer a city. They slipped through a crack in the climate's armor, proving that sometimes the deadliest weather is the weather that never comes. The battlefields of medieval Europe may have fallen silent, but the weather that decided them still whispers through our modern world. Consider how the storms that shattered the Spanish Armada didn't just preserve England's independence, they set the stage for a naval empire that would dominate global trade for centuries. Those same winds that favored Elizabeth I's defenders also carved the grooves of modern capitalism, with London emerging as the financial heart of a weather-shaped world. The Protestant winds, as they were called, didn't just blow ships off course, they redirected the flow of history itself. Look at the maps of Eastern Europe today, and you'll see the fingerprints of medieval winters. The Mongols' failure to conquer Hungary due to the Carpathian snows created a buffer zone that still defines cultural boundaries. Had Batu Khan's horsemen succeeded, the Hungarian language might have vanished under the steppes' tide, and Vienna could have become an outpost of the Silk Road rather than a bastion of Habsburg power. Climate didn't just alter battles, it sculpted entire ethnic identities. The frosts that halted Ottoman expansion at Vienna in 1529 didn't merely save a city, they preserved the Christian foothold that would later birth the Austro-Hungarian Empire, whose collapse still echoes in the Balkans' tangled borders. Even Europe's economic divide bears weather's imprint. The Little Ice Age that crippled Norse settlements in Greenland also reshaped trade networks, favoring southern ports like Venice and Genoa over the storm-battered Hanseatic League. Today's north-south wealth gap isn't just about modern policy. It's rooted in centuries-old climate shifts that determined which regions could grow, sail, or fight effectively. The droughts that forced Charlemagne's retreat from Spain presaged modern water conflicts where Spanish farmers and Portuguese ecologists still clash over shared rivers. Perhaps most strikingly, medieval weather warfare birthed enduring strategic philosophies. The English mastery of channel storms evolved into the naval doctrines that underpinned the British Empire. Russian generals who learned to weaponize winter against Napoleon and Hitler were heirs to Alexander Nevsky's icy tactics. Even modern disaster preparedness, from flood barriers in the Netherlands to heatwave protocols in France, carries medieval lessons about respecting nature's power. The true legacy of these weather-bent battles isn't just in borders or buildings, but in our collective memory. When European leaders today debate climate policy, they're unknowingly channeling kings who prayed for rain and emperors who starved for lack of it. The medieval world understood something we often forget. Civilization is always one drought, one storm, one unseasonal frost away from transformation. As we face our own climate uncertainties, we do well to remember that history's greatest conquerors weren't just armies. They were the invisible forces that made their victories possible or impossible with the turn of the wind. From downpours that drowned cavalry charges to frosts that forged empires, weather was the unseen force behind medieval Europe's turning points. These battles weren't just won by swords or strategies, they were decided by gusts of wind, sheets of rain, and the merciless bite of winter. Think about that for a moment. The fate of kingdoms often hinged on something as fleeting as a morning fog or an unseasonal thaw. It's a humbling reminder that for all our plans and ambitions, nature writes the rules. Today, as climate change reshapes our world, these medieval lessons feel startlingly relevant. We're not so different from those commanders praying for fair winds, except now the stakes are global. Rising sea levels, shifting growing seasons, and extreme weather events are the modern equivalents of the storms that scattered fleets or the droughts that starved armies. History shows us that civilizations thrive or collapse based on how they adapt to environmental forces. The societies that survived the Little Ice Age weren't the strongest, but the most flexible, the ones who changed their farming techniques, redesigned their cities, and listened to the land's warnings. This isn't just about looking backward. There's wisdom here for how we face our own climate challenges. The Mongols didn't conquer winter, they learned to ride with it. The Venetians didn't curse the Adriatic storms, they built ships to withstand them. Adaptation, not dominance, was their key to resilience. That same mindset could guide us today, whether it's designing flood-resistant infrastructure or rethinking agriculture in a warming world. So the next time you check a weather forecast, remember, you're holding a thread that connects you to centuries of human struggle and ingenuity. Those medieval generals staring at the skies would have given anything for our satellites and radars. But they'd also remind us that knowledge alone isn't enough. It's what we do with it that counts. If you found this journey through history's storms fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. What battles, weather, fate surprised you the most? After all, the past isn't just a story, it's a warning, an inspiration, and sometimes a mirror. And if we're wise, we'll pay attention to what it shows us.